You're listening to Talking Africa, the show that deconstructs the news from the continent, brought to you by the Africa Report. Head to our website, theafricareport.com, for the whole picture. I'm Nick Norbrook. Welcome to the show. This week, a discussion with Alex Magaisa, a lawyer who, amongst other things, helped draft the new constitution of Zimbabwe back in 2013. Alex was also an advisor to the Zimbabwe opposition leader and then Prime Minister Morgan Tsvangirai during the period of cohabitation with the regime of Robert Mugabe. He now teaches law in the UK at the University of Kent. He has a large and lively following online who await his big Saturday read with bated breath. And you can find Alex online at Wamagaisa. That's at Wamagaisa. I'm also joined by Patrick Smith, our editor-in-chief. Find him online at Patrick_Africa, and I'm at Nick Norbrook. We start with the Zimbabwe regime's brutal abuse of the opposition this week. We talk about the cronies who are benefiting from state largesse at the expense of starving Zimbabweans. And we look at the options for progressive elements wanting to pull Zimbabwe out of the rut in which it is presently.
The MDC wanted to host what they were calling a Hope of the Nation address, where Nelson Chamisa, the leader, was going to make a presentation to the nation. It's kind of a State of the Nation address, but they had put a spin on it as a Hope of the Nation address, and they had asked for permission from the police to do so at Africa Unity Square, which overlooks Parliament, but they were denied, and so they decided to hold this event at their party headquarters, which is not far from the original spot, but the police didn't want this to happen. The state basically decided to stop it, and they did so using extreme violence, the violence that we have seen on television screens over the last few days.
Those clips have gone around the world, and there has been the impression in the last 12, 24 months that different constituencies have gone out to protest. You've had journalists protesting, you've had doctors protesting, now the MDC. At what point do all these disparate opposition forces come together in one block?
Well, I think, that's the big question. But just to say that even this particular instance, it wasn't even a demonstration by the opposition. The police deemed it to be an illegal gathering and to be a protest. The attack by the police was completely unprovoked. But back to your question as to, we are seeing a lot of things happening in different parts of the country. In addition to the doctors, there's also been teachers, rural teachers in particular. So there are sort of sporadic protests depending on the needs of a particular profession. It seems to me that what is lacking at the moment is a kind of leadership that build some bonds between all these disparate groups, and I'm not sure that leadership will come from the formal political establishments, and I have my reasons for believing so. I think that you guys, obviously, I think you cover a lot more ground around the world in terms of how people react to crisis situations and protests. You probably would be better placed to give an insight into how these things have happened elsewhere. But my rudimentary understanding is that usually, things do happen from very unlikely sources. And at the moment, perhaps those unlikely sources are yet to emerge in Zimbabwe and sort of provide that galvanizing force. you will remember that in 2016 we had a movement which was a nascent movement, which was led by a previously unknown clergyman, Pastor Ivan Mawarire, and it had gathered quite a bit of momentum, and then unfortunately things happened, and it did not reach its full potential. But that gave us an insight into the possibility that there might be someone or some people out there who, out of wherever they may be, may emerge as those that might around which a movement might be built.
It did seem that the sort of the Mawarire protests were seized upon by elements of the security forces, who then, repurposed that anger to get rid of Mugabe and then install themselves in power. Obviously, there are elements within, perhaps the junior officers who can play that kind of role. Patrick, you've been in Sudan recently. The role of disaffected parts of the military was absolutely critical in that successful uprising. Are there parallels with Zimbabwe?
I think there are. I think the first thing to parallel to strike you is the power of the political military establishment in Khartoum, the rest of Sudan, and the similarity between that and the power of the political military establishment in Zimbabwe. And the regime that was toppled in Sudan this year in April had been in power for 30 years. And essentially it was this coming together of the military and a political project initially run by the Islamist National Islamic Front with al-Turabi and Bashir running it together. And it just seemed the immovable force. And no one believed that demonstrators, unarmed demonstrators, protesting and defying the guns would ever be able to take that edifice down. And lo and behold, momentum had started maybe 3 or 4 years ago with a series of protests, the formation of local resistance committees right across the country, and that built and built. And then towards the end of last year, December 2018, you saw a season of rolling protests, building up until there was a mass sit-in. And it was then in early April that all those groups came to Khartoum and just sat outside the military headquarters. And at that stage, they had persuaded the junior officers and other formations within the sort of security structures, enough of those people to support them. And I don't think that's entirely impossible in Zimbabwe. What you have in Zimbabwe is you do have that hardcore elite at the top of the military and security establishment who have done very well out of nigh on 40 years of ZANU-PF rule. In many cases, it's guys who are sort of coming up through the ranks in 1980 who are now right at the top. They've stayed there since then. And there's a lot of disaffection. There's a lot of frustration lower down the ranks, if you like. And I guess would be interesting to get Alex's view on this. To what extent are you seeing those sort of grassroots level organizations, the sort of resistance committees that you saw in Sudan? What's happening in Bulawayo? What's happening in the Midlands? What's happening in Harare itself and the suburbs and so on around it? Are you beginning to see political groupings, social groupings coming together?
Well, I think that Zimbabwe at the moment is at a stage, I would say, for lack of a better phrase, it's in a state of flux. And I think that civil society in Zimbabwe, which plays quite an important role and has played an important role in the past, has become quite a lot of it has become very professionalized. and you don't have the kind of grassroots activism that you would probably have seen in the early 2000s or late 1990s, and perhaps went on for another 10 years. It's almost like organized politics. So there's organized civil society. Before the last election, we had a few groups coming up, and around, of course, the time of the Mawarire this flag movement, we had quite a few groups which were coming up. But as Nick said, they seem also to have been enticed and infiltrated by members of the security establishment, and in doing so, got some of those young people a little bit compromised. And so that's a challenge. But what you are seeing is that Zimbabwe has become very informalized as an economy, and while people try to improvise to be resilient, you can see those pockets of resistance from within, and among the groups that they've created. And funny enough, some of those resistance groups are coming from within ZANU-PF itself. I mean, take, for example, the people called the Makorokoza. These are artisanal miners who have been encouraged to be really a lawless force by ZANU-PF elites, who benefit a lot from the activities of these young men. But they've also become a law unto themselves, resisting, for example, the force or the lawful authority of the police. And that in itself can also be a source of discontentment. And so the government might not realize that it's creating pockets of resistance from within, and that might galvanize, as you have said, about junior officers in the army, in the police services, who are not benefiting at all from the looting that has taken place over the past 40 years. At some point, they might just say, look, we are all suffering like everybody else, and they might not be persuaded to apply the force that we have seen over the last couple of years.
Alex, I mean, having said that about possible directions, I wondered what you picked up after the coup in November 2017, it's like 2 years ago now, where there were concerns that among the supporters of Mnangagwa, that he was going to struggle a bit to consolidate power, because you had those various power centers. You had the G40 group that had been aligned with Grace Mugabe, who we've heard very little of in the last 2 years, 2.5 years. And then the military itself, and these persistent rumors of poor relations between President Emerson Mnangagwa and his number two, Constantino Chiwenga, and then another set of power brokers grouped around the owners of Secunda, and so on, these oligarch groups, and that in fact even the regime itself is quite divided. Do you think that's just wishful thinking? And actually, when they saw what had to be done, that is, win the election in August 2018, they all closed ranks at the end of the day, and they made sure that ZANU-PF won. And yeah, there may be tensions, but at the end of the day, Mnangagwa has been able to consolidate power. And that's why, despite the pretty terribly dire economic conditions at the moment, there doesn't appear to be a real threat to Mnangagwa from within the ZANU-PF hierarchy or the armed forces.
Very interesting question, Patrick. My perception, or at least the way that I've characterized the Mnangagwa regime over the past 2 years, is that without us noticing, there's been a kind of a power sharing arrangement in Zimbabwe since the coup, and that power sharing arrangement is between the military or ex-military group and the civilians.